in the depths of a dense, forgotten forest, where the trees loomed like ancient guardians and the ground was rich with the smell of damp earth. A wildlife sanctuary stood in stark isolation. It was a place untouched by the noise of civilization, where the untamed creatures of the land roamed freely, shielded from the encroaching development of nearby towns. The sanctuary had been established years ago, not just as a haven for creatures at risk, but as a final frontier where nature could remain unaltered for generations to come. At the edge of this secluded world, a figure moved quietly through the thick underbrush. The man's movements were calculated, precise, his senses sharp. His name was Elias, a caretaker of the sanctuary, a guardian of the wild. He had spent years living in the small, weathered cabin near the forest's edge, learning its rhythms, its secrets, and its moods. Elias was a man of few words. His job was simple: to ensure the balance, to monitor the wildlife, and to protect this precious piece of land from anything that might threaten its fragile ecosystem. That morning, as the first rays of dawn pierced the dense canopy, Elias walked along the familiar path he had traveled so many times before. His breath hung in the crisp air, and the ground was slick with the remnants of overnight rain. His eyes were fixed ahead, but his ears were constantly attuned to the forest's sounds. The distant rustle of leaves, the chatter of squirrels, the occasional creak of a tree branch swaying in the breeze. Yet there was something different today, strange silence that hung heavy in the air. He stopped, sensing it. The forest seemed empty, devoid of its usual hum of life. No birds sang from the treetops. No rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Elias' instincts told him that something was wrong. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle slung across his shoulder, not for fear of any creature, but out of a need to be prepared for whatever might have disturbed the delicate peace of this place. His boots crunched through the wet leaves as he moved forward, his senses heightened. The sanctuary had always been a refuge for the red foxes, those clever, elusive creatures who had made the dense woods their home. Their fiery fur was a flash of red among the trees, their eyes sharp and alert, their movements swift and sure. Elias had watched their young grow up, seen them hunt and play, weaving between the trees like shadows. But lately, there had been whispers among the few people who had ventured near the sanctuary, rumors of a new threat, one that might change the delicate balance of this world. A shadow flickered across his path, and Elias froze, his breath caught. A red fox. The animal's fur gleamed in the morning light as it dashed through the underbrush, its lithe form barely perceptible as it disappeared into the trees. Elias followed, instinctively trailing it, keeping a respectful distance. His eyes tracked the fox's movements, but there was something off about this one. It wasn't the graceful, playful animal he was used to seeing. It moved too quickly, too erratically, as if something was driving it, a sense of urgency, perhaps. He continued onward, following the tracks, until they led him to the heart of the sanctuary. There, in a small clearing, he saw it. A cluster of foxes, all red and alert, gathered around a single, broken tree. The creature they had once known as a leader, a strong and capable alpha, was now lying on the ground, limp and motionless. The once vibrant fur had lost its sheen, and the eyes that had once sparkled with intelligence were now dull. Elias knelt beside the animal, his heart heavy. The fox had been injured, gravely so, but there were no signs of a predator's attack, no scratches, no bites. Just an overwhelming sense of sickness. He had heard of this before, diseases that could sweep through populations, leaving nothing behind but desolation. But what troubled him most was the silence. The foxes hadn't moved, hadn't scattered like they usually would. They remained a close-knit group, their eyes fixed on Elias, their gazes filled with something he couldn't quite place. It was as if they were waiting for something, waiting for him to make a move, to decide their fate. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness. A twig snapped, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of feet across the forest floor. Elias' heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. It was too heavy, too deliberate. A predator, one not native to this sanctuary. The ground vibrated beneath him as the creature approached. Elias' eyes widened as the first glimpse of the intruder came into view. A massive, dark figure moving swiftly through the trees. It was a wolf, no, larger than that. A hybrid. Elias had heard of these hybrids. Creatures born from the crossing of wild wolves and domestic dogs, brought into the area by poachers. They were faster, stronger, and more aggressive than the wild creatures that called the sanctuary home. And now, it was here, hunting the very creatures Elias had sworn to protect. The foxes, sensing the danger, bolted into the trees, disappearing like shadows. Elias stood frozen, the weight of the moment settling in. The hybrid moved closer, its yellow eyes locked onto him. It was hungry. And it wasn't just hunting for food, it was hunting to claim dominance. Elias knew he couldn't outrun it, but there was one thing he could do. He reached for the rifle, but before he could make a move, the hybrid lunged forward, its massive jaws snapping just inches from his face. He stumbled back, narrowly avoiding its grasp, and the rifle slipped from his shoulder. The hybrid circled, growling low in its throat, taunting him. In that moment, Elias felt something shift within him. His thoughts weren't on the rifle anymore. They weren't even on the hybrid. His mind flashed to the foxes, the ones who had always been here, the ones who trusted him to protect them. This wasn't just about survival. This was about preserving the sanctuary, keeping the wild safe from those who would destroy it. Elias turned and ran. He didn't look back as he sprinted toward the trees, using the thick underbrush to conceal his movements. He could hear the hybrid's heavy footfalls behind him, growing closer with each passing second. His breath came in ragged gasps, but his mind was focused, sharp. He had one chance. Reaching a small rise in the forest, Elias paused, gathering his strength. The hybrid was close now, its breath hot on his neck. But Elias had something the predator didn't. He leaped over a small ravine, landing softly on the other side. The hybrid hesitated for a split second before following. But as it landed, it missed its footing, tumbling into the dark, murky waters below. The hybrid let out a loud, guttural growl as it splashed, struggling against the current. But Elias didn't stay to watch. He ran, faster now, driven by the weight of his responsibility. He reached the cabin, the familiar comfort of home just ahead. The sanctuary was still there, still standing. The foxes would return, he knew that. The forest would heal, as it always did. But the tension in the air hadn't dissipated. The hybrid was only the beginning. The world beyond the sanctuary was closing in, and the balance Elias had fought to protect was teetering. As Elias reached the cabin, his breath still ragged from the sprint, he slammed the door behind him with a thud that echoed through the quiet woods. The urgency of the moment had left him disoriented for a brief second, but the safety of the cabin's walls offered little comfort. The sense of dread lingered like a fog that refused to lift. He knew that the hybrid wasn't the only predator lurking in the shadows. There were darker forces at play in the sanctuary, forces that weren't so easily defeated. He set his rifle down by the door, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The adrenaline of the chase was beginning to wear off, but the heaviness of what he had witnessed, the way the foxes had watched him with that unblinking, unwavering gaze, weighed on him. He needed to think. He needed a plan. The sanctuary had always been a refuge, a place where creatures could find sanctuary from the dangers of the outside world. But Elias had always known that even in the deepest corners of nature, there were forces beyond comprehension, forces that didn't follow the same rules. The hybrid was a warning, yes, but it was also a symptom of something larger, something Elias couldn't yet grasp. Elias paced back and forth in the cabin, his boots scuffing the wooden floors. He hadn't heard anything from the sanctuary's monitors, no alerts of poachers or trespassers. The sanctuary was remote, hidden deep within the forest, and it was supposed to be safe. But as he glanced at the weathered maps on the wall, a thought began to gnaw at him. There were areas within the sanctuary that he hadn't ventured into in years, corners that had remained undisturbed. It was then that a sound broke his thoughts, low, distant howl, cutting through the stillness of the forest. Elias froze, his heart tightening in his chest. That wasn't the howl of a typical wolf. It was deeper, more unsettling, as if the creature was calling from the heart of the forest itself, pulling at the very edges of the sanctuary. It was a challenge, a defiant cry meant to echo across the land. The sound reverberated through the cabin, vibrating in his bones. It wasn't just the hybrid, something else was stirring in the depths of the forest, something far more ancient. Without thinking, Elias grabbed his rifle and headed back out into the cold, unforgiving air. The cabin's warmth was a distant memory now. The forest beckoned him, calling him into its heart, urging him to confront whatever had disturbed the fragile peace of this place. He couldn't afford to hesitate, not now. The forest was darkening, the shadows growing longer with every step he took. The howl had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. As Elias moved deeper into the woods, his senses heightened once more. The sounds of the forest had returned, but they were different, now more urgent. The rustling of leaves had become a nervous whisper, the crackle of twigs underfoot sharp and tense. Elias' breath formed visible clouds in the cold night air. His eyes darted between the trees, scanning for movement, listening for any sign of life. But it was the absence of life that unsettled him most. The birds had stopped calling. The wind seemed to hold its breath. He wasn't alone, but there was no sign of what was watching him. As he moved further into the heart of the sanctuary, he came upon a clearing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. And there, in the center of the clearing, Elias saw it, a circle of red foxes, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight. They stood perfectly still, as if frozen in time, their bodies unmoving, their gazes locked on him. The air felt thick, heavy with something unseen. It was as if the forest itself had drawn a line in the sand, waiting for Elias to cross it. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by another howl, closer this time, far more guttural and primal than before. Elias turned toward the sound, his heart racing in his chest. The creature that had called out to him wasn't far. He could feel its presence, something immense, something powerful moving swiftly toward him. But what troubled him the most wasn't the howl itself. It was the way the foxes responded. They didn't scatter, as they should have. They remained in place, watching him with those eerie, knowing eyes. It was as though they were waiting for him to do something, to make a decision. A decision that would change everything. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift. Elias' instincts screamed at him to run, to retreat to the safety of the cabin, but something in the air held him there. Something ancient, something that connected him to the forest in a way he couldn't understand. The red foxes moved as one, stepping back, creating a path. Elias hesitated for only a moment, his mind racing. There was something beyond his understanding happening here, something he couldn't explain. He followed the path they had created, his steps slow, deliberate, as if the forest itself was guiding him forward. As he reached the center of the clearing, a cold wind picked up, swirling around him. The foxes stepped aside, leaving him standing alone in the moonlit circle. And that's when he saw it. Emerging from the darkness, from the depths of the forest, was the creature. It was enormous, its body wrapped in shadow, its eyes glowing a faint amber. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a hybrid. It was something else, something that had lived in the forest for centuries, unseen, unknown, until now. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, its presence overwhelming. It didn't move, but its gaze never left Elias. It wasn't hunting him. It was waiting for him. And in that moment, Elias understood. This was not a battle between man and beast. This was something far older, something far more primal. The forest had chosen him. The foxes had chosen him. And he had been brought here for a reason. The creature, as ancient as the forest itself, let out one final, long howl that echoed through the clearing, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. Elias stood there, frozen, as the wind picked up again, the forest alive with whispers of things unsaid. The foxes watched him one last time before melting back into the trees, their silhouettes vanishing into the night. The balance of the forest had shifted. Elias had been tested, and he had passed. But the sanctuary, the delicate peace he had fought to protect, was no longer just his to guard. The forest had its own will, its own secrets, and it would always find a way to remind him of the delicate dance between man and nature. Elias turned and walked back into the woods, his steps heavy but resolute. The red fox dilemma was far from over, and there were still many mysteries hidden within the sanctuary, waiting to be uncovered. As Elias made his way back through the dense trees, the weight of the night settled around him like a cloak. The forest felt alive in a way it never had before. Its sounds, its rhythms all felt as though they were moving in time with his heartbeat. The foxes, those silent sentinels, had guided him deeper into the sanctuary's heart, revealing something he could hardly comprehend. His thoughts churned as he walked, each step dragging him toward a truth that had remained hidden for generations. His rifle still lay at the cabin, useless now. The creatures of the night didn't respond to bullets or threats. They were woven into the fabric of the land itself, part of something far greater than anything Elias had encountered. He could feel their presence in the very air he breathed, and he realized now that the sanctuary had never truly belonged to humans. It had only been borrowed. But what would happen if the creatures of the forest began to reclaim it? If they grew too numerous, too bold, would the fragile balance Elias had worked so hard to maintain crumble? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but Elias refused to entertain fear. He had been chosen whether by the foxes, the hybrid, or the forest itself. He wasn't sure, but he knew he couldn't ignore what had transpired tonight. Whatever had lurked in the shadows, a familiar scent broke through his reverie, earth pine, and the faint trace of something else. Something musky. He stopped in his tracks. The night was too still for this to be a natural scent. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes swept the woods around him, trying to locate the source. For a moment, nothing moved. But the shadows, thick and dense, were never quite empty. Then it happened. A rustle in the underbrush. It was soft at first, the sound of something brushing against the low branches, the earth shifting under the weight of a creature's movement. Elias held his breath, instinctively crouching into the cover of the trees. The noise grew louder, closer, and then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a flash of red fur. The fox had returned, but it wasn't alone. Behind it, barely visible in the dim light, were several others more than Elias had ever seen before. They were silent, their eyes reflecting the moonlight, glowing with an intensity that almost seemed unnatural. There was no playful curiosity in their gaze, no mischievous glint. It was something darker, something purposeful. He waited. The foxes moved with slow, deliberate grace, circling him without a sound. Elias could feel the weight of their gaze, their attention, as though they were sizing him up. The red fur shimmered in the muted moonlight, and for a moment, Elias felt the sharp sting of uncertainty. What did they want? What was their purpose? Then, from the dense undergrowth came the sound again, the heavy thud of a creature, moving with a speed that didn't seem possible for something so large. It was a growl, deep and guttural, shaking the trees. Elias' blood ran cold. It was the hybrid. He dared not turn, though he knew it was close. He could sense its presence, like a predator, hovering just beyond the limits of his vision. The foxes, sensing the danger, suddenly stopped circling him. They froze in place, and Elias realized the foxes weren't there for him. They were there to protect him from the hybrid. He slowly crouched lower, keeping his back to a massive oak. The foxes, watching him closely, remained still as shadows themselves. The air was thick with tension. Then, with a sudden, startling motion, the creature emerged. Its amber eyes glinted with a primal hunger, and it moved with fluid grace. The hybrid was not like any animal Elias had ever encountered. It was part fox, part wolf, its fur a tangled mix of red and black. Its massive frame was built for speed and strength, but it carried a quiet, almost eerie intelligence in its gaze. It moved toward Elias, its breath shallow but steady. The foxes didn't flinch, didn't run, and for the first time, Elias understood. They weren't simply protecting him, they were keeping the hybrid at bay. The hybrid, its eyes narrowing, stopped just a few feet away. It sized Elias up, the creature's sleek muscles rippling beneath its fur as it slowly circled him. The foxes stood in a loose perimeter around him, their eyes now locked on the hybrid, their fur bristling. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The tension in the air was unbearable. Elias' pulse thudded in his ears, but he remained motionless, his every instinct screaming to run. But he knew if he made a single move, the hybrid would strike, and the foxes too would likely be caught in the crossfire. The foxes were waiting for the right moment. Then, as if by an unspoken agreement, they moved as one, a blur of red and black, darting toward the hybrid with a speed and ferocity Elias hadn't expected. The hybrid recoiled, its snarl echoing through the trees. It leaped backward, its powerful legs pushing off the earth with a burst of energy. But the foxes were relentless, outmaneuvering the hybrid, darting between its legs, nipping at its heels. In the chaos of the attack, Elias realized something. The hybrid wasn't the apex predator it had seemed. It was merely a part of the delicate balance of this forest. The foxes weren't fighting to kill, it was a challenge, a contest for dominance, and they were willing to fight for it. Elias didn't know how long the battle lasted, but when the dust finally settled, the hybrid was gone, retreating into the shadows, defeated for now. The foxes stood in the clearing, breathing heavily but unscathed. The moon hung high above them, casting an eerie light over the battlefield. Elias stood motionless, trying to process what had just happened.